Thank you for having me here. We are going to continue, I guess, this California conversation from this morning. And just for kicks and giggles, some nice pictures. This is how the winter was. These were our winter rains in the last 4 years. With this being one of the results, empty reservoirs and old car wrecks showing up, bathtub rims and orchards being abandoned because of lack of water, people running out of water, wells running dry. As Doug mentioned this morning, there were over 2,000, mostly domestic wells that ran dry. This is a graph that we came up with that puts a little bit more perspective on just how severe this last drought was, but also how severe the repeated impact of several droughts in short sequence has been over the last 14 or 15 years. These are what somebody has called flame graphs that have been generated to show some of the longer-term droughts based on tree rings with 1,200-year records. This is only the last 120-year record of rainfall in California. So this is the rainfall. At the bottom row is annual average rainfall in California. The second row of colors is the 2-year annual total rainfall. The third row is the 3-year annual rainfall. So the higher up in the graph you go, the longer is the averaging period. And the bigger the red flame is, the larger is sort of the combined impact of drought or multiple droughts over a short period of time. And the thing that you can see on this graph very nicely, there's a big flame that came out of the 1920s and early 1930s associated with the drought we had in California and in the West then. And we haven't had a big flame like this until perhaps now, where the flame that's been generated off of the dry years we had over the last 15 years is really starting to grow to something that's comparable to what we had in the 20s and 30s. And that's really a big challenge because our water system in the West and in California in particular, as we've heard this morning, was not really designed to operate under those kind of rules. Doug this morning mentioned for California the huge amount of water infrastructure that we've generated to bridge what I call the spatial and time gap between when we have rainfall and when we need water, where we have rainfall and where we need water. Doug also mentioned that we have essentially 3 storage reservoirs to carry water over from wet periods to dry periods. We got our snowpack, we have which is about 15 million acre feet a year, we got about 43 million acre feet in surface water storage, and we got our groundwater storage. And my talk is going to focus on that groundwater storage, first from a water quantity perspective, but then also from a water quality perspective. What I like to say in California, what we have, and this is true for many of the western groundwater basins, not all, but many, is that they're like sediment-filled bathtubs, with the bathtub walls being our mountains, and they actually continue underneath the sediments. And then these valleys that we have in California, shown here in yellow, that's actually sediments that fill these bathtubs. And it's the groundwater that's in these sediments that we're accessing. It's being recharged by return flows from the landscape, whether it's a natural landscape or an irrigated landscape. It's recharged by rivers that are leaving the mountains and in their upper alluvial fans are typically losing rivers to recharge the groundwater. And I like to show this cartoon to kind of illustrate how groundwater actually works. Where that water ultimately comes out, if you keep filling the sediments in this bathtub, is right at the lowest point, right? That's where that groundwater table is going to show up. And that lowest point in most of our basins is a stream. And so these streams at the bottom of our basins are usually streams under natural conditions would be streams that are gaining water and balancing out that input that comes from landscape return flows and from rivers that are recharging these groundwater basins along the mountain front. Now we've invented a pump and we're taking some of this water out in the summer and we're letting it recharge in the winter. But in the process, we're taking some water. As soon as you take any groundwater out, especially those of you that are from Washington State know this very well, as soon as you take any groundwater out, you're taking it away from somewhere else where it would have gone, whether it would have gone into that river or whether it would have gone to riparian vegetation or to wetlands, but you're taking it from somewhere else just to keep this whole system in balance. We use this groundwater storage and kind of slightly dip into it over the summer and go back into in the winter. In most cases, the groundwater use is relatively small compared to the overall storage. I mentioned this morning we have probably in excess of 1,000 million acre-feet of groundwater storage. And we're using on an average annual basis, we're using about 15, 16 million acre-feet of groundwater. That's about 1/3, a little bit over 1/3 of our total water use. This is on an average year. In the last 4 years, we probably used an additional 6 million acre-feet of groundwater each of the last 4 years. And the recharge has been much less than normal, so we've probably gone out of balance each year, well over 6 million acre-feet per year, making the total over the last 4 years close to 25 or 30 million acre-feet in just the overdraft, the drought overdraft. So another way to show sort of this role of groundwater as a reservoir system is to look at a landscape budget. This is a budget for a groundwater basin in the southern part of this Central Valley that's very typical for the Central Valley and even some of the coastal basins. And what I'm looking here at is the water that goes onto the landscape and the water that then leaves that landscape either down to groundwater or up into the atmosphere. On the in blue are the various waters that get put onto the landscape. Light blue is rain, middle blue is river water, and dark blue is groundwater that's being pumped to irrigate crops. On the negative side, evapotranspiration is shown in red. So that's your consumptive water use that we talked about this morning. In orange and in yellow, that's water that leaves the landscape to go back down to groundwater, either directly out of canals and rivers or out of the irrigated landscape as return flow to groundwater. So there's a number of things to show here. Most of the precipitation in California is in the winter months. But then the irrigated landscape actually receives even more water during the summer months, some of which from surface water, some of which comes from groundwater. Summer is when we have most of the consumptive use, but we do have, because of the inefficiency of the system, and we talked a lot about efficiency this morning, because of the inefficiency of the system, we do have actually significant amounts of groundwater recharge during these summer months from irrigation return flow. That's a very important part. So when we talk about increasing irrigation efficiency, we're really talking about taking this part of these orange pieces and yellow pieces of groundwater and using it to go to the red part, which is the consumptive use, by expanding on our crop acreage or by growing more tomatoes on the same acreage, which results in more consumptive use, or by growing 3 cuts of alfalfa or 8 cuts of alfalfa instead of 2 or 6. And so going more efficient from a groundwater perspective means we're actually losing a significant amount of our recharge. Now, this is how it looks like in a normal year. In a wet year, there's a lot of recharge that comes out of this agricultural landscape, being very significant towards balancing that budget, that groundwater budget, with very little coming from groundwater and coming very, very late in the season. And then in a dry year, there's almost no recharge, and most of the surface water irrigation actually in this particular case comes from groundwater. So we have long-term storage operation where we're recharging in wet years and then using it in dry years. And these groundwater basins are perfectly designed for these kind of operations. We also have groundwater as a pipeline, so to speak. The pipeline function for groundwater doesn't usually extend across more than a few miles or a few tens of miles, but between water districts, all of which have different water rights, that pipeline function is very important. In this particular case, again, we're looking at sort of the southern part of the Central Valley. We have surface water rich districts surrounding this one district that has actually no surface water rights and relies entirely on groundwater pumping. Well, that groundwater basin under that district isn't isolated from the groundwater basins that's underlying the neighboring districts. And in fact, groundwater resupplies about 70,000 acre-feet of water each year to that groundwater-dependent district because of additional surplus recharge that's occurring in these surface water-rich, poor irrigation efficiency type districts. So that's an important function of groundwater. And if you look at the Central Valley, there's a couple models, groundwater models that we now have for the Central Valley, and both of these models show that the exchanges between these groundwater subbasins that we have created within the Central Valley are on the order of tens to hundreds of thousands of acre feet each year. So then, of course, in droughts, we lose that connection to the stream. We have these long-term drawdowns. And this is a couple examples of groundwater level drops that we see during droughts. And they are very repeatable. If you look at hydrographs, here's the 1977 drought, here's the 1988-1992 drought. This is the 2002-2004 drought, and it probably looked very similar here if we had the data on this particular graph. Similar on this other example, not that far away, it's very similar behavior in subsequent droughts. But the other thing you can see here also is the recovery is not sudden. We get one wet year, it doesn't recover all that lost storage overnight as it does in the case of surface water. We might get, with the El Nino winter now being the strongest El Nino that we've ever had, stronger than the 1997-98 El Nino. If we get a really big snowpack this winter, we're going to have this storage refilled, it could refill in the next 2 months, that snowpack. We could probably refill, with a large wet year, we can refill our 43 million acre feet of surface water storage in this 1 year. But we can't do that with our groundwater basins. The recovery for these groundwater basins is as slow as the drawdown is. So with sort of over the last 10 years going down most of the time, it's going to take us that long and that many wet years, above average years, to actually recover from that. That's the main takeaway. Some areas have only recently seen this kind of drawdown, but not in the earlier droughts, just because of the severity of the drought. And because of that severity, and because we're in this new flame, large flame, most areas in California, whether they're in the drier part or in the wetter part, are now seeing water levels that are significantly lower than they've ever been in the 20th century. This is a map showing the difference between the lowest water level experienced in the last 8 years and the lowest water level ever experienced in the 20th century. And it is negative, basically, for most wells that the Department of Water Resources is monitoring. And red on this graph means at least a 50-foot difference between the lowest point in the 20th century and the lowest point that we are now. Overall, groundwater storage in the Central Valley has declined by about 130 million acre feet in 2010. And if we add the last 4 years of drought to that, we're probably at about 150 million acre feet of groundwater loss. But that also means is we have created a storage capacity that's potentially usable and that we can actively manage in moving forward. Now, despite the fact that we have 1,000 million acre feet of water or more, before we ever run out of groundwater in California, we're going to have a lot of other consequences that we have to deal with that include, increased pumping cost. It includes land subsidence, water quality degradation, and others. Let me just show a couple examples here. Seawater intrusion happens when you lower the water level near the ocean to levels that are lower than the ocean, and then that seawater actually moves into your aquifer. This is from an LA example. In the Salinas Valley, we now have about 8 miles of seawater intrusion into the Salinas Valley aquifer just north of Monterey. We have had record number of wells drilled at costs of up to $2 million for an agricultural pumping well that is 2,000 feet deep in the Tulare Lake Basin. So there is not only the increased pumping cost and the decreased productivity, water productivity, but also the cost of drilling new wells. Land subsidence. This is the impact of land subsidence across the state, published this year by the Department of Water Resources. And in some of the regions here, this last year alone, we have seen between 6 and 12 inches of land subsidence across large swaths of land, impacting the ability mostly of canals to deliver water, including the State Water Project. The delivery capacity of the State Water Project has actually been significantly diminished by this land subsidence, by this recent land subsidence. And the ability of the San Joaquin River, which flows just north of Fresno and then empties out to the northwest. In this particular area, it will be very interesting. There is a much increased chance of flooding in that region because of land subsidence. Of course, it's impacted ecosystems as well, with one of the most significant impacts being in the Sierra Nevada. We're losing tens of millions of trees due to the drought. So the good thing about this drought is we have not wasted it entirely. We've actually created what we call the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Now, Buzz mentioned that we haven't actually lived without laws that govern the use of groundwater in California. But this is the first time that the state legislature actually has attempted to put a structure, an administrative structure across the state to force everybody to manage their groundwater, regardless of whether or not there's somebody in the basin ready to sue their neighbor over falling groundwater tables. So what the two principles are in this groundwater management legislation are that groundwater is managed sustainably for the long term. And the second principle is that groundwater is managed locally. Those are the two key pillars of the Groundwater Management Act. The state did not want to take on the responsibility of being the arbiter on groundwater management. There was a very strong movement to keep that management responsibility with local agencies. Now, the key question is, of course, what is sustainable? And the legislation was relatively specific, but not precise. The key pieces that the legislation says was sustainability is the absence of undesirable results. And then it goes on to say undesirable results are, and this is now our new 6 commandments in California, undesirable results are lowering water levels and lowering storage, degradation of water quality, which is an interesting connection that this Groundwater Management Supply Management Act actually makes explicitly the connection to groundwater quality. Land subsidence is another undesirable result. Seawater intrusion is an undesirable result. And then the 6th one, and that's another one that's very interesting because it's going to cause a lot of headaches down the road, is that to the degree that groundwater depletion impacts beneficial uses of surface water, including ecosystem function, these undesirable results would also have to be addressed under this Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So this is actually a very comprehensive act that really integrates across surface water and groundwater resources, and it does integrate across groundwater quality and groundwater or water quality and water quantity. Now, undesirable results, and this was a clever piece of this act, undesirable results that occurred before January 1st, 2015 do not have to be addressed under future management. Basically, the state said, we're already in the shithole, so to speak. Let's just not make it worse, right? We know we have work to do to just keep it where we are. Let's do that rather than trying to go all the way back to 1900. So the steps that will happen under this legislation are very comprehensive, and this is going to happen very fast. You might think that a 6 or 7 year horizon to implement this, and then a 20-year horizon after that to actually get the work done is very long, but from an administrative perspective, this is going to happen super fast. There's essentially 3 steps that are going to happen. The first step is going to be that we will have to create groundwater sustainability agencies. These are local agencies that are going to have to cover all of these yellow and orange basins. These are basins that have medium to high usage of groundwater. They're called medium and high priority basins. They're essentially medium and high usage groundwater basins. This is about 95% of all of our groundwater use in the state. These local groundwater sustainability agencies have to cover all of that yellow and orange area no sooner than June 30th of 2017, which is just around the corner. Now, some of these agencies have and can fall back on some of the planning that has been done under past groundwater management acts that have been created essentially on a voluntary basis with some incentives from the state, some monetary incentives from the state to do that. We have a number of basins that are governed by groundwater management plans, but they're nothing like what's going to be required under the new Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Some basins are going to have to hurry up, and these basins are considered to be in long-term overdraft, and they're going to actually have about a 2-year shorter time scale on the implementation of their plan. But overall, we're looking at these groundwater sustainability agencies being formed within the next 36 months, no, less than that, 18 months. These groundwater sustainability agencies can be any public agency, so cities, counties, water districts, irrigation districts, special acts districts, of which we have many in California. They are going to have relatively broad authorities, and there is a lot of action now happening in California. It's if you're a policy scientist or a groundwater wonk, this is an incredibly fun, interesting time. How do we get people on the ground engaged in talks about what this groundwater sustainability agency is? And in talking about who this groundwater sustainability agency is, at the same time already understand what that groundwater sustainability plan, which will not be due for another 5 years after 2017, actually looks like. Because that agency is going to have extensive authorities on funding, on cutting back groundwater pumping, on putting in projects. So there's going to be a lot of conversations, and agriculture is going to be a very big part of these conversations because they're 80% of the groundwater use in the state. The second step will be, and this is really the crux of it, to develop this groundwater sustainability plan. There will be 3 years given to the overdrafted basins and 5 years to everybody else to develop that plan. Now, we've had Groundwater Management Act that has done some of the basic things that need to be put into this plan. The plan, if I actually summarize it in 4 bullets, what needs to be in that plan is all the information that we have on the groundwater basin, the hydrogeologic assessment, the water budget assessment, all the ins and outs, the monitoring networks, all that needs to be described or put in place. So there's sort of the whole sciencey part, which is part of the groundwater sustainability plan. Part of the groundwater sustainability plan is going to be to manage the stakeholders, since there are many different water users that all want to have a say in this Groundwater Sustainability Act, and there are requirements in the Act to communicate what happens in these Groundwater Sustainability Agency with the public, also with land use decision-making agencies. There is a whole part of this, and I think this is maybe the most important part to make this work, is to have communication structures in place, facilitation to actually make this work. And then at the core of this is, and Doug mentioned that this morning, one is to increase the amount of supply that goes into this groundwater basin, and on the other hand, if there is not going to be enough supply to balance it, somebody's going to have to decrease the amount of usage, and that somebody is going to be the Groundwater Sustainability Agency. So those are the key pieces. Now, in terms of monitoring and assessment, which some of this afternoon session is about, there are some really interesting questions to ask in terms of what should be the minimum guidelines for these groundwater sustainability plans to make sure it works, and to not have the state be in charge ultimately of actually performing a lot of this monitoring and assessment. Now we have 120 groundwater basins or subbasins explicitly identified in this legislation that have to have agencies. And these agencies, there can be one agency in a basin, there can be many agencies in the basin. They all have to coordinate with each other. We might have, at the end of the day, 100 groundwater sustainability agencies, we might have 300 groundwater sustainability agencies. They all have to coordinate their monitoring and assessment efforts. The key piece will be to have some form of metrics associated with the 6 undesirable results. So metrics that identify undesirable results and that we can monitor, metrics that we can monitor in the field to show whether or not undesirable results are occurring. And along that, we will have to have trigger points that trigger management actions, and we will have a threshold that will be sort of the bottom line. We can take the reservoir down to that threshold and no further. Once it gets to that threshold, all hell breaks loose and we need to really stop groundwater pumping. Defining these triggers and thresholds and metrics is going to be up to the groundwater sustainability agencies. The Department of Water Resources on the state side will define the minimum guidelines for how this is being done. But these are going to be an important part of the monitoring system that will be in place. And so we will have these metrics that we measure and monitor: water level metrics, water quality metrics, stream flow metrics to show groundwater surface water impacts, subsidence metrics to show land subsidence. In the groundwater sustainability plans, there will be actions that define what needs to be done now, actions that define what needs to be done when certain trigger levels are being exceeded, and actions that will have to happen when the threshold is being approached. So I think what the state will do, and this is still an open question, the state has actually not written its detailed regulations yet. That will happen in the next 8 months. What the state will do, it will set minimum guidelines around these metrics and thresholds and let the local agencies decide where they want to set their trigger levels and what management practices they want to use to manage their level, their water level with respect to these metrics so they are staying above the thresholds. And all of the monitoring and assessment will be on the local side, and it needs to be coordinated between these many different agencies. Part of this will be not just monitoring, but also a significant amount of modeling, and part of the discussions we now have in the state is how these models look like, what data go into these models, what data can the state collect for everybody, since everybody needs them, and what data do the locals collect, and what standards should we have for groundwater models that are being used to assess whether or not a plan is actually going to succeed. So lots of discussions and lots of ideas on best management practices. Urban areas, especially in Southern California, have implemented, and we heard some of those practices this morning, a number of local supply enhancement, groundwater banking, water recycling actions to make their water balance work for them. You saw this slide. This is essentially the inflows into Orange County Water District, basically their way to supply their groundwater basin, which is where they're taking their drinking water from, with various projects, local recharge, imported water, and more recently, their recycled water has been a very big part of their portfolio. These kind of actions will need to be implemented also in agricultural basins, and that's where we're going to need a lot of science and a lot of new policy to implement that so that we can manage these groundwater basins within predictable limits. Surface water groundwater interaction is going to be a whole new ballgame for California. We have done very little in the past on if anything at all, on managing that interface. Water quality is going to be another piece that I wanted to briefly mention and sort of give you a little bit of background on. In California, the largest and most widespread contaminants are actually naturally occurring contaminants. Chromium, we have a new drinking water limit just in California now for hexavalent chromium that is being exceeded by many public supply wells, and naturally occurring arsenic. Those are the two most widespread contaminants we have in our drinking water supplies, to the degree that drinking water supply comes from groundwater. On the human contamination side, by far the largest contaminant is nitrate. Nitrate occurs mostly in rural agricultural areas. There has been national assessments on nitrate in groundwater, and this is not just a California issue. We certainly have very widespread nitrate contamination in our aquifer systems, but you can see that most agricultural regions around the country have significant nitrate contamination in their production level groundwater. In the Central Valley, there are counties like Merced and Stanislaus and Tulare County where 40% or more of domestic supply wells, to the degree they're actually monitored, 40% or more of domestic supply wells exceed the drinking water standard for nitrate. In many other counties, it's over 20% of domestic supply wells. We recently completed a study for the southern part of the Central Valley, which we're currently extending to the whole Central Valley, to look at the various sources of nitrate. And we go through wastewater treatment plants and urban areas and septic systems, food processors, and then agriculture. And agriculture turns out to be over 95% of nitrogen leaching into our groundwater basins, and largely because of the imbalance between how much total nitrogen we add to the landscape from synthetic fertilizer and manure, and how much nitrogen we're taking off the landscape, which is these green bars. This is the harvest amount of nitrogen, which is about or less than half of the amount of nitrogen that we're putting onto the landscape from these. And so as a result, much of that surplus nitrogen that's basically between this level and this level, a total level going onto the landscape, the difference between the green bars and the red line, much of that is actually leaching into groundwater. And this is an assessment that we did sort of on a crop by crop, field by field basis. With the highest inputs coming in from animal agriculture, we have a significant concentration of dairies, concentrated animal facilities that have huge impacts on groundwater quality. In this color scheme, we consider anything that's sort of in that yellow and orange part to be at a level that would make that recharged water to be above the drinking water limit. If you have more than about 30 to 50 kilograms of N per hectare, or pounds of nitrogen per acre, in your annual recharge of about 1 acre foot, that recharge exceeds the drinking water limit. So most of this agricultural landscape actually recharges water that's above the nitrate drinking water limit. Now, how do we deal with that from a policy perspective? There is no national legislation that says that you can't pollute groundwater with nitrate. If we look at how we regulate groundwater quality, and this is different from groundwater quality, although things like the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act are now linking those two. On the surface water side, to the degree that surface water quality is impacted by stream flow, we've also linked the Clean Water Act to water rights. On the groundwater side, I like to distinguish between what we have done about point sources of pollution and what we are doing about non-point sources of pollution. And we do have to distinguish between how we treat surface water quality and how we treat groundwater quality. When we created the Clean Water Act in 1970, we created it specifically to deal with surface water contamination. It does not include groundwater at the federal level. In California, we actually have the equivalent to the Clean Water Act, the Porter-Cologne Water Quality Control Act, which was written 3 years earlier than the Clean Water Act. And California, therefore, with Porter-Cologne, actually explicitly includes groundwater as a water body. If you discharge into that water body, you have to obtain a permit. Now, initially, on the groundwater side, we have focused in terms of federal regulation on how to deal with point sources of pollution. The groundwater storage tanks under gas stations, the dry cleaners, the industrial sites, the landfills, and we've created a number of acts to deal with existing pollution and to deal with the handling and disposal of chemicals, including pesticides, pesticides being the one contaminant that actually is subject to sort of more on the what I would consider to be on the non-point source side. Initially the Clean Water Act was all about NPDES permits, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits, basically a permit to allow you to discharge your waste into a stream out of a pipe. And with that permit came some kind of monitoring system and a mandate to have a wastewater treatment plant or to clean up that waste to certain levels, practice best available technology. And as long as you practice that technology and your monitoring data were within allowable limits, you obtained that permit and you were good with the permit. In the 1990s, we had NGOs sue EPA for not implementing one part of the Clean Water Act that actually dealt with non-point sources. That was the total maximum daily load part of the Clean Water Act, which says that at the outlet of a watershed, and remember the Clean Water Act is only surface water, at the outlet of a watershed, even if everybody who discharges out of a pipe into that watershed has a permit, a valid permit, if at the end of the day that watershed delivers water that's not healthy, that's not meeting environmental standards, everybody in that basin, the folks that have the permit already, and the folks that are non-point source polluters, have to sit at a table and figure out how to improve the situation. So under TMDL, we actually have leverage to go at non-point sources of pollution, and we've done a lot of watershed management on non-point sources, which one big one is agriculture and the other big one is urban stormwater runoff. And on both of those, we've done a lot of work to address TMDL. Now, on the groundwater side, with respect to nitrate, we have really nothing at the federal level. In California, we had nothing for a long time, even though Porter-Cologne actually regulates discharges to groundwater, because the original act had a general waiver to non-point source, given to non-point sources. They did not have to go out to the state and get a permit to discharge their water into groundwater. That's both stormwater, septic systems, or agriculture. In 2002, that waiver went away, and since 2002, our state regulatory agency in charge of water quality, the regional water quality control boards, are struggling to figure out ways on how do you regulate a non-point source of groundwater pollution for their discharge. They're very used to saying, let's put a meter onto the discharge pipe. So in a wastewater treatment plant, this is sort of the speed limit analogy that I like to use in trying to explain how this regulation actually works. On a speed limit, you got a responsible driver, you got a speedometer that gives feedback to the driver. The driver has a gas pedal and brakes to manage the speed, and you got the cops with the radar gun to figure out how fast you're driving. A wastewater treatment plant has, instead of the brakes, it'll have a treatment works. You have a responsible party. You have water quality meters sitting around your wastewater treatment plant to tell you whether the wastewater treatment plant is operating properly. And you have water quality monitoring going on upstream and downstream from your discharge point that the regulatory agency is using to make sure that you're actually properly performing your duties, that you're within the speed limit. Now, on an underground storage tank, with respect to groundwater pollution, the way the regulatory agencies operate that is they will have a double-walled tank for the gasoline tank under the gas station. Will have a double-walled tank as a management tool. It will have a leak detector as a speedometer. It'll have the gas station owner as the responsible party. And the regulatory agencies, their template is to have monitoring wells upstream and downstream from that underground storage tank to make sure that it's actually properly performing. And so when these regulatory agencies, which all grew up around point source pollution in the last 40 years, out of these legislation that we created in the 1970s and 80s, our California agencies now have to rethink all of their templates and see how they apply it to the agricultural landscape, which are millions of acres rather than 1 to 10 acre sites. The plumes there is no plume to deal with in the first place. The intensity is not anything like you have with gasoline pollution. You don't have non-leaky systems. Agriculture, stormwater drainage is leaky by design. You have that leakage going on a repeated basis, and pollution sources are adjacent to each other. They're not separate. It's where you could put a monitoring well between pollution sources to see which one actually pollutes how much. So there are challenges with respect to how we monitor, how frequently we monitor, and what we use to regulate nitrate discharges to groundwater. And initially our agencies said, let's put monitoring wells everywhere. Every dairy farm in the state gets 3 monitoring wells. Every farm in the state gets 3 monitoring wells. And agriculture was very, very opposed to that. Where we are now is actually with an alternative program that's sort of a triplet of actions. One is a monitoring of the nitrogen budget on a farm scale and on the field scale, which is a proxy for that nitrogen discharge. You look at all your inputs to the field and all of your outputs, save what's going down to groundwater, and when you take the difference between your inputs and your outputs, you get an estimate of the magnitude of what's going to groundwater. That's the first step. Then there are coalitions of farms that will have to show for their particular farm type that they can actually know how to do management that avoids groundwater contamination. And then we will have as a third piece regional trend monitoring programs, which we're currently trying to figure out how to design those to make sure that the whole trainload of non-point source pollution is actually going into the right direction with respect to protecting groundwater quality. And we've created a number of new programs in California under this new, that are sort of following this very new pathway that's a learning curve for the regulatory agency, that's a learning curve for us scientists. In groundwater, on the groundwater side, we've worked on groundwater, local groundwater contamination, but not on this non-point source pollution piece as well. And really challenging us to connect as groundwater scientists with agriculture in ways that we have not before. And it's a new challenge for urban areas and agriculture to control their groundwater discharges in ways they have not before. And that's in parts where some of the connection is to SGMA, to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and to water supplies. To the degree that nitrogen leaching is caused by poor irrigation efficiency. And that's really the biggest driver of losing nitrate to groundwater is poor irrigation efficiency. You're flushing the fertilizer that you're applying to the land out of the root zone before it can be used by the plants. So from the nitrogen perspective, the mandate to agriculture is high irrigation efficiency. And they're going there not so much because that's a regulatory driver, but because they're seeing a lot of efficiencies, monetary efficiencies doing that, because when they go to these high irrigation efficiency systems, they typically increase the amount of crop production by a significant amount. But on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, with that high efficiency, we're losing a lot of their recharge. So managing groundwater quality in a better way actually means we're losing some of the groundwater supplies. And as we're moving forward, these two things need to be brought together, and we need to think about ways we can recharge groundwater in the agricultural landscape in ways that doesn't also pollute groundwater, and maybe in ways that actually addresses some of the existing groundwater pollution. I think I stop it here and open it up to questions.